If I can invite Bahija and Nick to come up to the stage, and we're going to do a three-way question and answer session. So questions, please, if you make it clear who your question's for, and then if it's relevant to the other two, I'm sure they'll chip in. So we have people around the room with microphones. Over to you. Kevin.
Thank you very much. This is probably a question to all of the speakers. By the way, incredibly inspirational. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that session. Just a thought about the total cost of drug development, which is indicated to be something like $1.3 billion or whatever. If you're now looking at personalized medicine with a much lower demand and therefore income level, what should change in the clinical trial process to enable us to actually get to that point where those medicines become available?
Yeah, so I can start. I think there's a lot that needs to change. You know, first of all is the length, the time it takes, right? So, and I think that's my hope, at least with the technology, we can do that even faster. So the collaborations at the beginning, that needs to stay because of the biology. But I think, so the 1.2 billion is also the cost of failure, right? So we need to decrease that failure. And actually, that's where I see the huge impact of translational, of the technology and everything. I think everything you talked about is very inspiring. That's really where I see the future. But we're not there yet, you know, so how can we use that? And that's why I said we need to collaborate outside of our industry, because right now, for the wearable, there is nothing validated, right? So you have this data. So how can we, you know, collaborate with the Googles of the world and others to bring that into not only doing clinical trials, but really be part of speeding up that clinical trials?
Nick.
Yeah, there's, so I think a lot, I'm speaking really from the rare disease kind of perspective, and I think in the rare disease perspective, particularly when you have very strong integration, coordination with patient groups, there is then a real potential for reducing the cost and also the time that it takes to do these clinical trials. That's from our experience.
So yeah, it's a huge cost. I guess one of, you know, my day job in terms of focusing on real world evidence and real world evidence generation in terms of how you think it can help drug discovery. If you take something like a disease such as Alzheimer's, for example, you know, understanding at which point in a patient's life they, you know, have cognitive behavioural impairment, and therefore when the drug is actually going to work and the best target's really difficult. But actually, by using big data, by using predictive modelling, by looking at population health, to understand actually what the sweet spots, what the opportunities are for actually to conduct a clinical trial in a time frame where you might see the best benefit for your medicine. Because it might be that the medicine fails because actually the population you chose was you know, too advanced, too progressed, or not advanced enough, so you don't see the benefit. So big data, real world analytics is essential in the drug discovery to improve that productivity.
Does that answer the question, Kevin?
Yeah.
Okay. The questions, yes, Taslim.
Excellent presentations. I learned a lot. The question is to Bahija primarily. I just wanted to understand when, you know, the entire trend is going from personalized to individualized medicine, how much sharing data between different studies done by different companies is, you know, it's important, because otherwise you're going to still looking at a small population. There has to be an effort where all the data come together so you can actually have a cross talk between what could be a possibility. Otherwise you're still in that pool as well. So I want to understand a bit more on that.
Yeah, I think we've seen a shift that's really happening in the pharmaceutical companies as a whole, and biotech and everything, is that which was completely unheard of before. You know, it was very much inward looking. And I think now looking at, you know, nobody can do it by ourselves, and I think the realization also that it doesn't really matter, like 1% of any institution will have 1% of the talent. What you've seen, and I think should be encouraged, is that the pharmaceutical companies are opening up a lot more. There is a lot more collaborations, either with academia, but also what's happening is between companies. We can always do more, and it is at the end of the day, there are areas where you can compete, but there is a lot of areas where you can benefit from working together. So I think it's a trend that's going in the right direction, and hopefully will continue. But I don't want to just, because we also don't hold all the data. And I think to your point is really a very good point, is not only with the patients, but also the insurance companies and all the stuff, because they sit on a lot of data in the real world, as you talked about, that you learn a lot more to apply into the next generation. So it's not perfect, but at least, looking at 10 years ago or something like that, there's a lot more openness than before.
Other questions? Yes. Yeah, Flick.
Gabe transcript. I was very impressed by everything that was said, and I think there's a huge shift going on at the moment around the development of drugs as being part of society. And one of the things I would like to ask is, it would appear, as somebody who worked on one of the drugs on one of your slides on severe asthma, where we struggled very hard to persuade the regulatory authorities that that was a part of asthma that really needed attention. And we were constantly being told, even by academics, that this was due to poor compliance, that it didn't exist, and this sort of thing. I think one of the big challenges, and I would like to hear from all of you on that, is that the concept of social impact seems to have been completely lost in terms of collaboration right across the board. And our whole thing about health technology and health economics has concentrated on treatment, not on social impact and the balance. And I think that comes right back to translational medicine, where I work, because often we can't get funding because people don't understand the social impact, the cost of the caring, the cost of 2 or 3 people down the line who might be involved in this. And I'd really like to know how we can shift the understanding of this disruptive thinking, of getting people to understand that the social impact is part of what needs to be funded right across the board. And I think that question would go to all 3 of you.
So if we start with you, Farid.
Yeah, so I think you raise a great point. If you think about when drugs get to market, if you take NICE, internationally renowned HTA body, we look at cost effectiveness. Now, a couple of years ago, they were talking about moving towards value-based pricing. So what can we claim is greater value? In fact, I think if our horizon scan on where the industry needs to be, because I think this is where our governments end up being, we'll end up with an outcome model. Yeah, we'll get paid on outcome, on delivering outcome. But to your point around capturing that social element, if you look at, in the States, there's the forum called Patients Like Me, which essentially patients sharing stories around rare diseases and how it's affecting them. So there's a bigger patient voice there. There's around about 250,000 patients. If you look at NICE, actually, they have a patient that sits on the advisory board for health technology appraisals. And in fact, quite often it's the patient voice that influences the decision to bring that out. But essentially, yeah, if you think about, if I think about my nan, and I was conducting a phase 3 clinical trial, I would collect care PROs, because, in the end stages of my nan, when she was being cared for palliatively, she was for the entire family. There was days lost in terms of productivity, in terms of work. The whole family was stressed. My uncle was being treated because of it. That wasn't captured. That wasn't built into, the clinical trial design at all. So how can we do that? And unless we start thinking more broadly about the impact of society, we won't be there. If the Alzheimer's, if you think about 1.3% of the population today has Alzheimer's. By 2050, 21% of the population will have Alzheimer's. How are we going to care for those people? And so the government's not going to want to put them all in, care homes. It's not going to be affordable. We're going to have to measure, look after them ourselves. Our parents at home, ourselves at home. What's going to be the impact going to be? How do we capture that? So we have to capture that with data.
Nick?
Yeah. I think that's a really important point, and it's something that in the rare disease sector we're increasingly looking at, the whole kind of social impact of rare diseases. I mean, I'll give an example. In black bone disease and alkaptonuria, we did a study with a consultant, a volunteer who was at KPMG, an accountant. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to find out how much the average alkaptonuria patient was costing the NHS untreated. This was before nitisinone, and we found that it was around £100,000 a year. And that was just the direct costs, you know, of hip replacements, joint replacements, all that kind of stuff. But he calculated that if we brought in all the social factors, so if we brought in the kind of unemployment, the disability allowances, the fact that often the spouse or the partner or the parents or whatever would have to stop working, the mental health issues, the fact there's a lot of depression with these chronic diseases, all those kinds of things, it was around 3 or 4 times that amount, you know. So really, it's a very expensive, and it's often not taken into account. But there's something that we're actually working on at the moment, and that's the concept of a social impact bond. And we're doing this through Find a Cure and for the drug repurposing that we're doing. And we're in discussions actually with the NHS about this to try and move it forward. And the idea is that you calculate not just how much, so you have a drug X, which is generic, and you have disease Y, which is costing, say, £100,000 a year. And you can find that drug X is going to save the NHS a certain amount of money. But it's also, through treating the drug, also going to save the Department of Pensions some money. It's going to save the unemployment benefits some money, the disability some money, etc. And all that can go into a bond, which then gives returns based on the investment that you put into the drug. So you see what I mean? You start to quantify it, and we're looking at metrics to try and quantify this so that we can package it and come out with some kind of socio-economic metrics that can help us with that.
Yeah, so it's really an excellent, excellent point. I think I will add, just maybe not to discourage or to give a negative note here, but at the end of the day, at the beginning, you really, at the end of the day, you focus on what the regulators are going to accept or not accept. And that's the biggest hurdle first. So the patient I showed you in SLE, for instance, you know, the endpoints sometimes don't help us. You know, composite endpoints don't help us. So there's a lot. The patients I showed you with the clearance in the skin, anybody can look at it and say that's working. When you look at the endpoint, it scores negative, right? So we have to do better. We have to do better on these things. You know, on the severe asthma is the hospitalization. But it's not even counted as really the endpoint. Your endpoint is exacerbation, right? So I think where we see a little bit more success is when we work with, you know, Friend of Cancer Research or others, where there is lobbying not just from us, because we always are seen as to really move the regulatory bodies a little bit. I think we collect data, and we should collect even more, you know. But I think this is now we have a real opportunity with the technology as well to collect more, but we have to constantly work with the regulators, bring in the patients themselves and patients associations to help, and that's the only way we can show the impact on society. But at the end of the day, we always look. You know, if you have a great drug, but if you don't hit that exacerbation, you can have a great FEV1, it's not going to work. See, that's an issue.
Okay. Did you want to come back on that, Flick, or are you happy?
I completely agree, and particularly with that last point about the two things that are constraints constantly, especially for small companies, are funding and the regulatory side of things. So it makes life extremely difficult to take into account. And Nick, I think you said about the social impact, using that to raise funding, but it's often quite difficult because you do have a regulatory component running alongside, which is extremely challenging, where the convention says you need to go to a more conventional disease to get an outcome first before you can go into something else. And that makes life very difficult to go after the very high medical need areas where the social impact is extremely costly.
I think one of the other things I forgot to mention though, is that if you think about social media, and there's something called web scraping, and essentially you can pick up signals across the globe around, you know, people tweeting or what they capture in Facebook. So using natural language processing to understand what people are typing around their own disease. So you can pick up that signal. It's where you've been able to find it. So you can pick up that.
Hi, Sumat Kaur, Cambridge. I've got a question of Bahija. On one of your slides, you showed Bind Therapeutics, and they are a targeted delivery system using nanoparticles. And I was wondering, what do you see as nanotherapy and nanomed for the future to get safety and increased potential of drug delivery?
Yeah, it's extremely important. I think you know, you have drugs, for instance, like antibody-drug conjugates. We know they work really well, but the toxicity is still very high. You know, so if you can use something like the nanotechnology to even go even more targeted, I think now in oncology, for instance, where we're looking at manipulating the immune system, if you can go and do it actually directly in the tumor bed, it's going to be much better because you're playing a little bit, and you know, you're at the edge. You want to activate the immune system to get rid of cancer, but you don't do it too much that you don't get into the autoimmune, and you don't want to create the whole cytokine storm. So having something that could be very targeted would be of a huge benefit. So I absolutely believe in it. It's not where it should be yet. I think there is, and we can be more imaginative about it. You know, can we get the antibody to target the nanoparticles itself to the tumors and stuff like that? It's a really exciting technology, actually.
Okay. Yes, Eddie.
Eddie Blair, Integrated Medicines. You'd have enjoyed the Panorama program last night, talked about Liverpool and its attempts to get everyone active, and you know, using that as a way of building social medicine as well. I guess my question comes down to a question of ethics. So social media, people are using data and information to decide whether they're on a drug or not, and then often going along and re-registering to see if they can get off placebo or comparator and onto active drug. And then I think, Nick, you talked about a very simple test that indicated whether you're on drug or not and the impact that might have. And then I guess in the newer oncology drugs, there's a question of you test for someone, it shows a mutation that indicates they won't respond to a drug, and yet the randomized controlled trial still has to have them on that ineffective drug. So my question is, you know, how do you generate more ethical clinical trials in the modern era?
Bahija, because you first.
You know, there is always the issue, you know, so the ethical becomes first on, you know, when you have, I don't think we do ever trials on placebo if there is the standards of care, right? So you take the standards of care. It's really difficult because there's tons of things we see in phase 1 that don't replicate. So you have to have those randomized trials sometimes. It's a little bit more relaxed in oncology, if you will, because of all kinds of reasons. But in others, you really have to do that and biased, you know, randomized and everything, because you have no idea how many things we see in phase 1 that don't replicate itself, right? I think on the ethical, you know, it's very hard. You know, how can you have to, we are very regulated. And I'm trying to see if I'm really understanding your question or you're coming from. So if I don't answer it correctly, just tell me. You know, we have we are the most regulated industry, you know, frankly, from the ethics, and it's rightfully so. We have to, right, from the clinical trials. So there's tons of stuff that we have to do, that we have to adhere to, and everything. And I frankly don't want to relax it, right? Because we are dealing with, you know, the patient's informations and all that. So I don't know where you're going with your question. You know, you must have something more specific. if I'm getting it.
It was really around the question of it takes so long to develop drugs.
Yes.
It costs so much. And actually, quite often, you're giving patients a drug and denying them a potential comparator that could be effective. So it is very much a question of, should the industry be pushing back on regulators to say there's actually a more ethical way of doing clinical trials that doesn't involve, you know, giving medicines that clearly aren't going to work.
Yeah. So I think that's what I told you at the very beginning. It's you can get fooled as well, right? So there is a certain way where you really have to do in an unbiased way. There is a lot of things that you do at the same time. You know, stopping trials early. You do always the board to look at the data that you actually we're very sensitive, especially if you are in a disease where you really don't want to subject people to a treatment that's not effective. Usually we have what we call the futility analysis. That's in the middle of the trial. That's an independent board can look, and if the drug is efficacious, you do the crossover. So there are a lot of ways, even within the trial, that you can do without biasing the trial or something like that. But yeah, in cancer it's a lot less because you don't do as many randomized trials because of obvious reasons.
I'm going to leave the last word to Nick on this, I think. So.
Sure, okay. There's, I mean, this was a key question for us, the whole ethics of the trial and all that. And as a patient group, we really struggled with it because what we were being told is that the regulators, you know, are asking for the highest possible evidence, which is a randomized control trial. We didn't actually have the benefit of a placebo, so that meant that patients were either randomized to treatment arm or to non-treatment, or what we call the monitoring arm. And so we were in this fine line where, on the one hand, to recruit patients, we had to explain to them that, yes, this is a promising drug. It's shown promise in animal models, and you know, people who've been on it off-label have reported positive outcomes, etc. But at the same time, we couldn't be too optimistic about it, you know. And then also we were trying to explain to them, but it's promising, but at the same time we still have to do these trials, and if you get randomized to non-treatment, well, you're still doing good because we have to be able to compare. And so most patients understood that, but some really didn't quite understand that. And then when they got randomized to non-treatment, their family would ring up saying, you know, are you on the cure? Are you on the cure? And it's like, well, I'm not. And then they'd burst into tears and they'd get depressed. And, you know, it was a really, really difficult one. And as far as I'm concerned, you know, with the amount of evidence that we already had and the fact how difficult it can be to do these trials, you know, I'd have loved to find a better way of actually doing a clinical trial to actually prove that this works. But that is the gold standard, and that's the system that we work in. So we probably need reform of the system, at least, you know, from my point of view. But the second thing is also, I think sometimes randomized clinical trials are just not appropriate. So I'll give another example. This is from the brain injury field. So my nephew suffered a very severe traumatic brain injury 3 years ago. And about 2 months ago, my brother and I set up a new foundation called the Vincent Foundation in his name to work on brain injury. And we're particularly interested in pharmacological treatments for acquired brain injury. And I was just reading the other day a paper about progesterone, which had been proven in preclinical to actually have an effect on acquired brain injury. And they did a large trial of around 1,000 patients, and they didn't find anything, nothing at all. And all the doctors, well, the clinicians who were involved were like, well, that's because brain injury affects every single patient completely differently. So basically what that means is that the whole large randomized trials are a complete waste of time. And so maybe we should be looking at N-of-1 trials, you know, and completely different ways of approaching these things.
Okay. We've run out of time, so thank you everybody for your questions, and a huge thank you to Bahija, to Nick, and to Farid. Just to let you know their whereabouts for the rest of the day. Bahija, I'm going to nobble her first because I'm going to do an interview with her, and then she has to leave. But there are MedImmune and AstraZeneca teams here today who you can talk to about the technology and the translation of research. Nick's here till lunchtime. Farid till lunchtime too. So there'll be plenty of opportunity to grab the two gentlemen in the networking. Thank you very much. The next session starts at 11. Thank you, everybody.